On a quiet Sunday evening in the spring of 2009, a young mother climbed into her car in the parking lot of a busy Georgia supermarket, buckled her toddler into his car seat, and began walking around to the driver's side door. She never made it. Within seconds, her life was taken in plain sight of multiple witnesses, in a moment so sudden and so brazen that it left an entire community in a state of disbelief. And yet, despite the chaos of those first moments, the case would not remain unsolved for long, because the truth hiding behind this tragedy was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Heather Allen was born on April 20, 1984, in the small, close-knit town of Snellville, Georgia, a community nestled in the suburban sprawl of Gwinnett County, southeast of Atlanta. From her earliest years, Heather was the kind of child who filled every room she entered with energy and warmth. She threw herself into ballet, gymnastics, and cheerleading with equal enthusiasm, driven by a natural love of movement and performance. But Heather was not defined by athletics alone. She sang in her church choir with genuine devotion, and her faith was something she carried with her not as an obligation, but as a source of real comfort and identity. Her parents were deeply religious people who raised Heather in an environment of community, discipline, and love, and the church was very much the center of their family's social world. It was there, within the familiar walls of that congregation, that a teenage Heather first met a young man named Stephen. She was 16 years old at the time, and the two of them crossed paths through the church's youth group, a program designed to bring young people together in fellowship and shared faith. What began as a friendship blossomed quickly into something deeper, and before long, the two teenagers were officially a couple. Stephen made a strong impression on Heather's parents almost immediately. He was polite, well-spoken, and attended services regularly alongside his own family. He seemed like exactly the kind of steady, grounded young man a parent hopes their daughter will meet. And so, as the years passed, Heather and Stephen continued dating, their relationship maturing through high school and into young adulthood, with an understood assumption between them that marriage was somewhere on the horizon. When Heather finished high school, she began working part-time at a local flower shop, and what started as a simple job quickly became a genuine passion. She discovered that she had a real talent for floral design, and more than that, she loved the intimate role a florist plays in people's most important moments: weddings, funerals, anniversaries, and celebrations. Inspired by her enthusiasm, Heather and her parents made the decision together to open their own floral shop. It became a true family venture, with Heather handling the creative and day-to-day operational side of the business, while her parents supported the financial and administrative elements. The shop flourished. Heather's personality drew in customers, and her skill kept them coming back. The business grew steadily enough that the family expanded and opened a second location, with Heather effectively running both stores. For a young woman still in her early 20s, it was a remarkable achievement, and it spoke to the determination and capability that those who loved her had always seen in her. In 2004, at the age of 20, Heather and Stephen were married in a ceremony that reflected everything the two families had built together over the years. It felt like the natural fulfillment of a story that had been unfolding since those early days in the church youth group. 2 years later, in 2006, their son was born, and for Heather, that moment represented the realization of a dream she had carried for as long as she could remember. She had always wanted a large family. She had always envisioned herself as a mother, surrounded by children, building the kind of home filled with noise and love and laughter. The birth of her son, still very young and completely dependent on her, made all of that feel wonderfully, overwhelmingly real. But the happiness of that season would not last. Not long after the birth of their child, Heather made a discovery that shattered the foundation of everything she thought her marriage was built on. She found a receipt for expensive jewelry among Stephen's belongings, jewelry she had never received, and when she confronted him about it, he confessed. He had been seeing another woman, and it was not a brief lapse or a single mistake. According to those close to Heather, the affair had been going on for the majority of their marriage. The revelation devastated her. Even so, Heather's first instinct was not to walk away. She believed in the vow she had made, and more than anything, she did not want her son to grow up in a broken home. She persuaded Stephen to attend couples therapy with her, hoping that professional guidance might help them find a way back to each other. But Stephen had already made up his mind. After a single session with the therapist, he told Heather plainly that he was not interested in trying to repair the relationship. He wanted a divorce, and he intended to be with the other woman. The dissolution of their marriage set off a prolonged and painful legal battle. Stephen not only sought a divorce, but filed for full custody of their son, who was still barely a toddler. The custody dispute dragged on for months, grinding through the courts with each side presenting arguments about fitness and stability and the best interests of the child. As an interim arrangement, the court established a schedule in which Stephen would have the child every other weekend, with the two parents exchanging custody in a neutral, public location. a compromise designed to minimize direct conflict between two adults whose relationship had become deeply strained. The location they settled on for those exchanges was the parking lot of a local supermarket, positioned roughly halfway between their respective homes. Twice a month, Heather would drive there, wait for Stephen to arrive with their son, accept the handoff, and return home. It was a routine that carried with it a quiet, low-grade tension, a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Those who knew Heather well during this period recalled that she did not feel entirely safe during these exchanges. She described Stephen as increasingly volatile and at times physically aggressive during the years of their marriage, a pattern of behavior that had escalated as the relationship deteriorated. Friends and family members later told investigators that Heather had spoken openly about her fears, that she had deliberately chosen a busy, public location for the custody exchanges precisely because she did not want to be alone with Stephen. She often brought along a friend or family member for the same reason, unwilling to face those moments of tension without a witness nearby. On the evening of Sunday, April 26, 2009, Heather drove to that familiar parking lot for what should have been a completely routine exchange. The plan, as always, was straightforward. Stephen would arrive with their son, hand the boy over to Heather, and both parents would go their separate ways. The exchange was scheduled for 6 o'clock in the evening. The sky above Snellville was beginning to soften toward dusk, and the supermarket parking lot was moderately busy with Sunday evening shoppers coming and going. No one present that night had any reason to expect that the next few minutes would change everything. But at almost exactly 6 o'clock, emergency dispatchers began receiving a wave of calls, one after another, from different individuals who had been in or near that parking lot and had witnessed the same horrifying incident. Officers arrived to find a young woman lying on the pavement beside her vehicle. There were clear signs of violence at the scene, and it was immediately apparent to the responding officers that she was gone. In the back seat of the car, strapped safely into his child's seat, was a toddler boy, unharmed and unaware. Investigators quickly confirmed the identity of the woman as Heather Allen, 24 years old. The child in the car was her son. Working through the multiple calls to 911, investigators began assembling a rough timeline of what had occurred in those final minutes. Witnesses described Heather pulling into the parking lot at approximately 6 in the evening. A short time later, a man matching the description of Stephen arrived, and the two exchanged the child. Several witnesses observed what appeared to be a brief, tense conversation between them, though no one was close enough to hear the words. After the exchange, the man believed to be Stephen returned to his own vehicle and drove away. Heather then placed her son in his car seat and began walking around the car toward the driver's side door. It was at that moment that a second man appeared. This individual had not been noticed arriving. He approached Heather quickly and with clear purpose, and within seconds of reaching her, a short exchange took place between them. One witness heard Heather cry out for help. Moments later, the man produced a firearm and fatally wounded her at close range. He then walked away from the scene at a brisk pace and disappeared from view. The description of this second individual was consistent across multiple witnesses, and several of them used the same word to describe him: strange. He was a white male, thin in build, wearing khaki pants and a blue shirt, but what struck people most was his appearance. His hair was unkempt and seemed to stick out in multiple directions in a way that looked unnatural, almost like a wig. He also had a mustache. Several witnesses noted that they had noticed him before the attack, standing at a distance near some bushes at the edge of the parking lot, watching in the direction of Heather's car. His unusual appearance and that peculiar behavior of lingering and watching had caught people's attention even before the attack, which was precisely why so many of them were able to recall so many specific details. Investigators worked the scene carefully and methodically in the hours that followed. One of the first things that stood out was the absence of any apparent robbery motive. Heather's personal belongings were intact inside the vehicle. Her cash and valuables had not been taken. There was also no shell casing recovered from the immediate area, which suggested to investigators that the perpetrator had either used a revolver, which does not eject casings automatically, or had taken the time to retrieve the casing before leaving, both of which pointed away from a spontaneous, opportunistic crime. The portion of the parking lot where the attack occurred was not covered by any surveillance cameras, which meant investigators could not view the moment of the attack itself. However, they were able to locate the figure on cameras covering other parts of the property. The footage showed the suspect walking away from the scene and moving in the direction of a wooded area located behind the supermarket. Investigators also noted something specific about the way this individual moved. Despite walking quickly, the man had a visible and pronounced limp on one side. K9 units were brought in to attempt to track a scent trail from the scene, but the trail went cold near a road adjacent to the supermarket property, suggesting to investigators that the suspect had likely reached a parked vehicle in that area and driven away. Unfortunately, that stretch of road had no surveillance coverage. Taken together, the evidence presented a picture that detectives found increasingly hard to read as anything other than a premeditated, targeted act. The subject had positioned himself at a distance before the exchange took place, watching and waiting. He had approached only after Stephen had left the scene. He had taken nothing from the victim and left almost nothing behind. To the investigators building this case, that level of calculation pointed unmistakably toward someone who had known Heather, who had known her routine, and who had chosen this particular moment with deliberate care. Detectives began reaching out to the people closest to Heather, starting with her parents and the friends she had known for years. Every single person they spoke with described a woman who was warm, kind, and fundamentally non-confrontational. She worked hard, she loved her son, she was devoted to her family and her faith. Not one person could point to an enemy, a feud, or any conflict that might have motivated a stranger to target her. But nearly every person they spoke with pointed investigators in the same direction. They said, "Look at Stephen." The picture that emerged from those conversations was troubling. Heather had been involved in an increasingly bitter custody dispute with a man who had, by multiple accounts, been verbally and physically abusive toward her during their marriage. She had told people close to her that she feared him, that she had deliberately built safeguards into their custody exchanges to protect herself, and that even after the separation, the conflict between them had not diminished. But as investigators turned their attention toward Stephen, they also began to learn about another figure in Heather's life who had made her deeply uneasy, his mother, Juana. According to multiple family members and friends, Juana had never warmed to Heather, not during the marriage and certainly not after it began to fall apart. She had made her disapproval plain in ways that were, at times, openly hostile. She had been known to take the child from Heather without notifying her, behaving as though she had a claim to the boy that superseded his mother's. When the divorce proceedings began, Juana became even more aggressive, directing blame squarely at Heather for the breakdown of the marriage despite the fact that it was her own son who had been unfaithful. Heather had told the people she trusted most that Juana frightened her, that the woman was unpredictable and hostile, and showed up in ways that felt threatening. As investigators began to explore this angle, a truck driver came forward with information that immediately elevated Juana to the top of their suspect list. This witness stated that on the afternoon of April 26, 2009, he had been traveling on a road near the supermarket and had noticed a Ford pickup truck parked on the shoulder in an unusual position. Driver of that truck, he said, was a woman who appeared to be in the process of changing her clothes, pulling off what looked like a wig and switching outfits. The detail was specific enough to be striking. Investigators checked Juana's vehicle records and confirmed that she owned a Ford pickup. When they brought her in for questioning, she acknowledged that she had been in the general area that day and provided a receipt from a cafe in a neighboring town as her alibi, claiming she had been there at the time of the attack. Investigators then drove the route themselves, traveling from the supermarket to that cafe at the maximum legal speed. The drive took 1 hour and 20 minutes. Juana had stated that she left her home at approximately 5:20 in the evening. By investigators' calculations, that left her a window of roughly 40 minutes, more than enough time to drive to the parking lot, carry out the attack, and then continue on to the cafe to establish her alibi. But despite the growing weight of circumstantial evidence, detectives needed more before they could move toward an arrest. They made the decision to bring Stephen back in for another interview, and this time they showed him the surveillance footage from the supermarket, the footage that showed the suspect walking away from the scene with that distinct, recognizable limp. For the first few moments, Stephen sat quietly, watching the figure on the screen. Then the detectives told him what they believed, that the person in the footage was his mother. What followed was a long silence. Stephen stared at the recording, and then haltingly, he confirmed that the limp, the gait, the way the figure moved matched his mother's. While Stephen was still absorbing the weight of what he had just said, investigators asked him to make a phone call. They wanted him to call Juana directly, with the conversation being recorded. Stephen agreed. He called his mother and told her that he had just come from another round of questioning, during which investigators had shown him surveillance footage from the parking lot. He told her that the person in the footage looked a great deal like her. Then he asked her directly whether she had been responsible for what happened to Heather. Juana denied it, but then she asked him, with an eerie calm, whether he had told the detectives about his suspicion. When Stephen said yes, Juana paused briefly and then said, in a matter-of-fact tone, that she supposed she should expect the police at her door and begin preparing herself. The composure in her voice when confronted with that possibility was chilling in its own way. Investigators returned Juana for another round of formal questioning, but she maintained her denials throughout. While the evidence continued to feel tantalizingly close but not yet conclusive, a warrant was obtained to search her pickup truck. What they found inside changed the complexion of the case significantly. On the steering wheel, forensic technicians identified traces of gunshot residue, the kind of trace evidence consistent with someone who had discharged a firearm and then gripped the wheel shortly afterward. And inside the vehicle's interior, they recovered a small black fiber that laboratory analysts determined was a synthetic hair fiber, consistent with material from an artificial wig. With that evidence in hand, investigators now had a workable theory of the complete sequence of events. Juana had planned the attack carefully and in advance. She had selected the Ford pickup because it was the least distinctive vehicle she had access to. She had obtained a disguise, a wig and a fake mustache and men's clothing, knowing that witnesses would describe a male attacker and that the description would send investigators in the wrong direction. She had driven to the supermarket, parked or waited in an unmonitored area, and positioned herself at the edge of the lot where she could observe Heather's arrival. She waited until Stephen had completed the exchange and driven away, leaving Heather momentarily alone and vulnerable. Then she approached. Whatever was said in those final seconds, Heather recognized the danger she was in. She called out for help. A moment later, Juana fatally wounded her with a single shot to the head and walked away, moving behind the building and into the wooded area, where she had likely already positioned a getaway route. From there, she drove to the cafe in the neighboring town, presenting the receipt as proof she had been nowhere near the scene. Investigators also spoke with people from Juana's past as the case developed further, and what they uncovered added deeply unsettling layers to her profile. Her former husband, Stephen's father, told investigators about an incident during one of their arguments in which Juana had produced a .38 caliber revolver and pointed it directly at his head. The detail was significant for two reasons. It confirmed that Juana had access to an unregistered firearm, and the caliber she had reportedly brandished matched the caliber used in Heather's killing. A former coworker of Juana's then came forward with an account that stunned investigators. She said that roughly a year before Heather's death, Juana had described to her, in unsettling detail, how she would commit the perfect crime. Juana had said she would use the Ford pickup because it was the least noticeable vehicle in the family's possession. She had spoken about the importance of getting a receipt from a business at a safe distance from the crime scene to establish a credible alibi. And she had said she would use a revolver specifically because revolvers do not jam, and when she was done, she would dispose of it by throwing it into a body of water. Every element of that hypothetical description matched what had actually happened. Despite the significant circumstantial case built against her, Juana continued to profess her innocence throughout the months that followed. The prosecution made the decision to move forward with a trial, and in the spring of 2011, nearly 2 years after Heather Allen was killed in that supermarket parking lot, the case went before a jury in Gwinnett County. The defense leaned hard on the fact that every eyewitness had described the shooter as male, and that the physical evidence, while suggestive, was not direct or conclusive. Stephen, who had by then apparently retreated from his earlier identification, testified that he had not truly recognized his mother in the footage and claimed that detectives had pressured him into saying that he had. The prosecution countered with a body of evidence that was, while circumstantial, remarkably consistent and coherent. The surveillance footage showing the figure with the distinctive limp, the gunshot residue on the steering wheel, the synthetic hair fiber matching wig material, the failed alibi. The former husband's account of the firearm, the co-worker's account of the chillingly prescient hypothetical conversation about committing the perfect crime, and then the prosecution called one final witness. While Juana had been held in custody awaiting trial, a fellow inmate came forward to say that Juana had confessed to her in their shared cell, admitting that she had shot Heather and expressing anger and contempt toward the young woman, describing her repeatedly as a bad mother who had never deserved her son or her child. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict. On May 27, 2011, Juana was found guilty of the murder of Heather Allen and sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole consideration for a minimum of 30 years. 2 years later, in 2013, Juana's legal team attempted to appeal the conviction, arguing that the evidence had been insufficient to support the verdict. The Georgia Supreme Court reviewed the case and upheld the sentence in full, affirming the jury's findings and closing the last legal avenue available to her. For the family of Heather Allen, there was no clean resolution, no outcome that could restore what had been taken from them. Heather's son, still just a toddler when his mother was killed, was placed in the care of her parents, the same family that had raised her in Snellville, the same community where she had grown up singing in the choir and dancing in the church gymnasium and building a life she had every reason to believe would be long and full. He continued to have contact with his father, Stephen, though investigators who had spent considerable time examining the custody dispute came to believe that Stephen's original push for full custody had been driven far more by pressure from his mother than by any genuine desire to be the child's primary caregiver. As for Stephen himself, investigators found no credible evidence that he had known in advance what his mother was planning. His reaction on viewing the surveillance footage and the stunned, halting quality of his phone call to her afterward was consistent, in the investigator's assessment, with a man who was genuinely confronted for the first time with the possibility that a parent he loved had committed an act he could barely bring himself to process. The case of Heather Allen stands as a sobering reminder of how darkness can exist in the most familiar places, in the routines we build to protect ourselves, in the people we believe we know, and in the quiet moments that can turn irreversible in an instant. A young mother who had done everything right, who had chosen a busy public place for safety, who had built a life of faith and work and love, was taken in the span of a few seconds by someone driven not by desperation or mental illness or random cruelty, but by a cold and calculated desire to reshape the future of a family that was never truly hers to control.